It's time for the Alien Conspiracy Podcast. We are your hosts, Agent ETA
and Agent Anderson. Come along as we examine UFO sightings, conspiracies, and all things strange. You can follow the show on Twitter at AlienConPod. We also have an email address, alienconpod@protonmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to check us out on Discord, where you can interact with the hosts and ask us questions about the show. This week's episode, The Death of Hitler. Man, the music was a little louder this week. I swear I didn't move that slider. Whatever. All right. This week we have a very special guest joining us, Icarus Kane. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast?
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. I'm starting a podcast called Aliens After Dark, and it's pretty similar to your podcast. We do conspiracies, historical events, and really anything weird and wonderful. I try to do a lot of research for each episode, and so far I've done about 4 or 5 episodes, 6 episodes, and we should be starting to release them here within this next month. So really excited about that. But yeah.
Yeah, I really like that name, Aliens After Dark. My show name, I just chose my show name based on SEO basically. I'm like, oh, nobody took this yet? Aliens and conspiracy? That's perfect. I'll just use that,
But, yeah, you kind of stole that. That's kind of messed up, but no. I had a good name. I wanted to do a riff on UAP, like unidentified aerial phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So I was going to do unidentified alien podcast, but that's taken. So
of course
I was like, well, I'm not going to not do the podcast. I just have to come up with a better name,
Yeah, it actually took me a really long time to find a name because guess what? All the good names are already taken.
Yeah. Yeah, those guys, those theorists, man, they took the good one from Ancient Aliens. I was like, man, that's a Bogart, the good name.
Yeah. Well, that's actually Braden from Alien Theorist Theorizing helped me indirectly choose the show name because on one of his shows, he made a comment like, oh yeah, we're pretty alphabetically, we usually come first. So, yeah, you'd have to try pretty hard to get a show name alphabetically ahead of us. And I said,
that's why I did mine like that too.
I said, challenge accepted.
I did Aliens After Dark, so it'd be AA.
That's hilarious.
That's so funny.
Nice. I don't know if that makes any difference or not, but it was a way to narrow down that, because I had pages and pages of ideas and I wasn't sure which direction to go. So it helped me narrow it down a little bit.
Yeah. I hope it helps.
Yeah. Hey, you never know. All right. Let's get into this week's topic, the death of Hitler. So this one it's a conspiracy, obviously, and it's been going around since like 1945 or whatever, that a lot of people have thought that Hitler didn't really die in the bunker. So do you want to talk a little bit about like the background information, or where do you want to start, Icarus?
Let me see what I got here. So 1945, it's a weird thing. As soon as it happened, I think in the 1950s, they did like a survey in the United States, and 50% of Americans said that they didn't believe that he committed suicide. So you have half the country that believes he escaped. So almost right away, I mean, definitely right away, there was like these holes and gaps and misunderstandings of what actually had happened as to, did he escape? Did he actually commit suicide?
Now, part of the problem, I think, with that is that when he was in this bunker, the Führer bunker, and him and his wife in there supposedly committed suicide. And by his this is what I read. I don't know. I couldn't really verify this, but by his instructions, his underlings took their bodies out to, a courtyard or a garden, put gasoline on them, lit them on fire. So when we're talking about, like his remains, we're talking about burned up remains that were probably then bombed and shelled afterwards. So we're talking about like bits and pieces of a burned skeleton, basically. We don't have a whole lot of evidence to go on, right? Would you say that's correct?
Yeah. So it's kind of a weird thing. So Hitler, he didn't want to get married. And the whole reason why he never got married was because he felt like he was married to Germany. What's that?
Oh, it might have been related to him only having one testicle.
Oh yeah.
He was just embarrassed about that.
That's a whole funny story. He was actually very self-conscious about that. But he told everybody that he was married to Germany, and it would take away from his duties to his country and to the state if he had, a wife and a family to also, take his time and his affections and stuff. So he was wanted to come off as like extremely dedicated. And also I read in a couple places that if he got married, women would treat him a little differently. And he wanted all, German women to kind of idolize him. And if he was still single, then there was still an opportunity for them to kind of present themselves and so one of the main reasons why it kind of holds up that he probably committed suicide was because at the end he finally gets married, and he basically divorces Germany and gets married to Eva Braun. And then there's a will and testament that he puts out in his last few days. He makes one will a will that he gives things to the state and to Germany, and then he makes a personal will. And in one of them, he basically says, I think almost verbatim, that he's going to marry Eva Braun, and then they together will go into their private quarters and commit suicide, end things at that point. So I think that's a big point that like he wouldn't have gotten married unless he was intending to kind of end everything himself and ultimately, together.
Yeah, and I had a thought earlier about that. I was thinking that's kind of messed up that I don't know if he made her. She probably went along with it, but I mean, Ava could have probably pleaded like, plausible deniability, like,
yeah.
They might have thrown something at her, but she probably
I doubt she would have been hit with any war crimes or anything like that. I mean, what did she do,
Exactly. So she could have gotten off pretty much scot-free. I mean, she would have been a pariah for sure, but I thought that was interesting. I was thinking about it. I was like, why did, she didn't have to, but she was probably really loyal to Hitler, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, very.
Yeah.
She wanted to get married for a long time, and she wasn't supposed to be in the bunker. In those last few weeks, he had a bunch of people, coming and going, and he was kind of running the Reich and the war from the bunker. And so he had a lot of people. He had about 20 or so people that were there the whole time. So you have people like his drivers, his I think a pilot, a couple engineers. I know Bormann was there most of the time, and one of the leaders of the Hitler Youth was there. A couple doctors and
some guards.
Yeah, a bunch of guards on the outsides and stuff. And so Eva Braun actually ended up showing up and had wanted to get married multiple times, but he always put it off and kind of told her, like, I'm married to Germany. I'm not going to take a wife. And when she showed up at the bunker, he told her to leave and told her, like, you need to go back to, I think it was just Bavaria or Berchtesgaden or somewhere different, maybe the Alps, where they had a different like chalet, but she refused, and she was like, no, I'm gonna stay here and ride this out with you. And then in the last few days, it kind of got a little bit more like serious. They started talking about suicide. They started it was weird because he started bringing it up a lot. And then they had these conversations of the best way to do it, and it got to like these kind of morbid conversations where not just him and Eva Braun, but like a lot of the Nazi officials that were down there with him. Goebbels was one of the main guys that was there. Is one of his most loyal people, and so you have
was Goering down there too?
Goering was in and out. Bormann was there the whole time.
Yeah.
And it is a really weird thing. So you have about a few people, like Bormann especially, and Goebbels, which Goebbels was the propaganda guy.
Yeah.
And they were, incredibly loyal to Hitler. But most of the other high-ranking Nazis, they kind of saw the end of the war coming and the downfall of Hitler coming. And so like Himmler, Göring, and a few the other guys started to kind of turn on him. The architect, Albert Speer, he kind of turned on him as well. And you have this weird kind of moment where everybody knows Hitler's kind of losing it, mentally and like governmentally. Like he's losing the Reich and he's losing the war. And he's losing his mind for a little, like to an extent. And so you have a lot of people who are just kind of waiting to see who the next Führer is going to be, and where, like, trying to align themselves with that power line. And Himmler betrayed Hitler towards the end, and Hitler put out like an execution order on Himmler and called for basically his arrest and execution. It was a really weird power grab thing that people were kind of waiting to see who gets power next, and I need to make sure that I'm on that person's good side before this all goes to shit. But
now another problem I read about that could perpetuate these conspiracies is that it was not actually the Allied forces that discovered Hitler's remains. It was the Soviets. That's what I found when I was looking earlier. Was that correct?
Yeah, that's another weird facet. So basically the Allies were coming in from the west in Berlin. They had most of Germany. They had the western side of Germany, and so you have the Americans, the French, and the British are closing in on the west side. Then you have the Russians are closing in on the eastern side, and they pretty much have all of Berlin is surrounded. And so a little bit of the backstory or background for that is Germany killed about, or I guess it's better to say Russia or Soviet Union lost about 10 million men fighting Germany. I think, let me see my notes. It was 7 million died in action, and another about 3.6 million dying in German POW camps. So the Germans, or the Russians. So the Soviet Union is pissed, and they have a kind of a debt to settle with the Germans. And so basically Eisenhower, instead of starting another conflict with the Soviet Union, kind of gives them the honor of taking Berlin and having that, that victory or that defeat of Hitler and of Germany and that revenge, I guess.
Yeah, well, because the war with Germany and Russia started with the breaking of a non-aggression pact that Hitler and Stalin had signed together.
Yeah.
So to go back on that agreement, is obviously a quite disrespectful, and also the extreme loss of life that they had to deal with. I mean, those are crazy numbers. How many people that died just in that, just with the Russians?
Yeah. So just the Soviet Union, 10 million.
Yeah.
And that's, that basically gave them reason to kind of fight the Allies for that right to kind of claim victory or whatever. So I guess I'll kind of explain the end days, or the last few days, but like I had mentioned, they were kind of started discussing how they should kill themselves and how they should end this, and once basically he wrote his will, but he told a few of the people how he wanted to be treated, or how how he wanted his funerary, service to go after he committed suicide.
Yeah.
And there was a moment. Okay, so on the night, so April 29th, he gets married. On that afternoon or that evening, he gets married to Eva Braun, and then the next morning, he kind of has this, like, I think there was like a breakfast, like a feast kind of, and then he kind of walks through, everybody kind of lines up and gets together, and he walks through and like gives everybody, this look, and they all kind of know what's about to happen. And then him and Eva Braun go into his private quarters, and they hear one gunshot. It said that, I think I read that it was Bormann and Otto Oxman, who's the head of the Hitler Youth. So I think it was those two guys who went into the room and saw Hitler's body. So they were sitting on a couch. Hitler was slumped over to the left, I think, and Eva Braun was on the right with her. So it's on a couch. So her knees were up, like her feet were on the couch, and she was grabbing her knees almost like in a fetal position. And she had like an excruciating look on her face. And Hitler had blood on his side and his arm of the couch, and there was no blood on Eva Braun's side. They also said that she smelled of almonds, which is basically like kind of what would happen if you took a cyanide pill, and they didn't smell any on Hitler. So there's a that's one of the mysteries about, like, how did he kill himself? Did he also take a cyanide pill? Because he had talked about doing that, like biting down on the cyanide while he pulls the trigger. And so that there's kind of a mystery there. That's one of the actual big mysteries that's unsolved or what have you. But it's kind of a fucked up thing where this little tidbit, but he told, or Eva Braun asked him, is this going to be painful? And he actually told her that, it's completely painless. You don't have to worry. And it's actually one of the most excruciating ways to commit suicide. So he straight up lied to her. Yeah. It's supposed to be like really terrible, but he just straight up lied to her and told her it should be, you won't feel a thing. And when they found her, or when they came in and found her, she had like an excruciating look on her face, and her veins in her neck were kind of popped out. So right after that, I think it was Bormann and Otto Oxman. They wrap their bodies in blankets and they take them outside to do like this like Viking funeral. One of the discrepancies is like when they were interviewing all the survivors from the bunker, they were asking, did you actually see Hitler? And they were kind of being coy, I guess is a good way to put it. But like they were answering their questions without giving the interrogators what they wanted. So they'd be like, well, I didn't see his face. So I didn't, I can't say 100% for sure that it was Hitler. But like if you imagine yourself in the bunker and like he went into this room, nobody else goes into this room, you hear the gunshot, you know what happened. Like you're being a little bit coy with the fact that like, no, I didn't see his face. And so after that, they take the bodies out into the kind of like the courtyard. They take them up and out of one of the emergency exits. And Hitler had specified that he didn't want anybody to witness this. It was only for the, this close few that had been in the bunker with him. But like we kind of mentioned earlier, like this is the end of the war, and the bunker's being like constantly shelled and bombed. So to take his body out there and burn it is like a big task. Like you have to do this while there's bombs going off and gunfire and stuff going off in like a couple blocks away or a block away. Like you're constantly hearing this literally war going on while you're trying to give your Fuhrer a Viking funeral that he requested. So it kind of speaks to their loyalty, but they had like, I think, I can't remember the exact number. I think it was like 200 gallons of gasoline or of petrol to use to keep his body burning, because he was worried about the Russians or the Soviet Union getting a hold of his body, putting it on, putting his head on a stake and parading it through Berlin and through Munich, all these different places in like as a trophy. And so he didn't want that. So so they kept the bodies burning. They buried him, or they put him in actually a artillery crater, a shell crater, and they had to keep going back to the bunker once they had it lit, and they had to keep going back and forth to put more gasoline on it to keep it lit. And at that time, there was all these like guard shacks of these much lower ranking Nazis who were just guarding the place, who are witnessing kind of what's happening. And again, you're not just going to go and keep a body burning unless it's like, Hitler. You're not going to do this for just a regular guard. You're not going to do it even for Goebbels, which we'll see in a minute. But they kept it burning for, I think it was like 6 to 8 hours. Like it was a long time, and they wanted almost nothing to be left. And then they took the remains to a different area. I think it was just another crater, and they ended up burying it there. And then, some more people like Goebbels, his story's totally fucked. It was him, his wife, and his 6 kids were in the bunker with him. And this is totally jacked up. But basically, he ordered the murder of his children. He had a doctor go in and give them morphine shots, and they were told that it was a vaccination. And then I think it was the doctor again came in and gave them all cyanide pills. And one of his daughters, I think a 12-year-old daughter, woke up, or like there's evidence that she kind of fought back.
She struggled.
Yeah, she struggled and fought back to an extent. And again, that's one of the other points that like, if Hitler was escaping, Goebbels would know. If Hitler was escaping, Goebbels would have escaped and wouldn't have committed suicide, him and his wife wouldn't have allowed the murder of her children. And the main reason was like she didn't want her children to grow up in a world without this national socialist, democracy or whatever, you want to call it. But she didn't want her children to grow up in a world that they assumed was going to be communist.
Wow, that's messed up.
Yeah, that was one of the rougher parts of this whole, story or historical event, was that I couldn't imagine doing that. But I mean, like I said, it kind of lends a little credence to the fact that he probably did commit suicide, because again, you wouldn't be doing that if you're Goebbels, unless unless you knew that Hitler had already done this. But basically, once Goebbels and his wife committed suicide, I think they both just took a cyanide pill, and they were taken out to be burned as well. But kind of in relation to Hitler, they were only burned for like an hour, 2 hours, maybe 3 hours. It wasn't as much care taken with their bodies to make sure that they were burned in the same fashion, and also by that point there was more bombing. The Soviet Union was a lot closer, and it was a lot harder to keep those bodies, aflame. So when they found Goebbels and his wife, it was a lot more recognizable.
Yeah, they were much easier. It was much more easy to identify the bodies.
Right.
So like when they found what they thought was Hitler's body, it was burnt so damn bad. Like pretty much the only thing they can go off of was a dental records.
Mm-hmm. And I'll kind of go back a little bit, but one thing that a lot of the people described when they were escaping the bunker, or a lot of the survivors were escaping the bunker. One reason why I really think that Hitler did this, he wanted ultimate destruction of everything. at this point in time. Like he was pretty much, he knew that the war was over, he was losing, so he wanted to destroy all of Germany. Actually, let me read you a quote real quick. So this is Hitler talking to his architect Albert Speer, and Speer had it was one of his best friends, but he had kind of turned on Hitler, and which is a weird thing because this is one of the only people that turned on Hitler that he didn't turn on. Like he turned on Himmler and ordered Himmler's execution because Himmler wanted to surrender to the Allies, because he knew if they surrendered to the Soviet Union that things were going to be a lot worse. So Himmler wanted to like orchestrate the surrender, and Hitler was like, fuck no, fuck you, like we're all going down and we need to like burn everything. And so when the people were escaping from the bunker, Hitler had ordered anybody who wouldn't stand in he started something called the People's Army, and he ordered every last citizen to stand and fight, and anybody who wasn't was to be executed by the SS. So the SS is just out there running around killing Germans, and when these people escaped from the bunker, they reported like, men, women, and children hanging from trees and light posts, and these are like
wow,
regular German people, not like Jewish people, not war victims or anything like that. Like these are just the regular population that they were ordered to kind of kill. And so like it's this morbid like war scene that they kind of came out of the bunker to witness. But I'll read you this quote real quick. So this is Hitler talking to Albert Speer. He says, quote, "If the war is to be lost, the nation will also perish. This fate is inevitable. There is no need to consider the basis even of the most primitive existence any longer. On the contrary, it is better to destroy even that, and to destroy it ourselves. The nation has proved itself weak, and the future belongs solely to the stronger Eastern nation. Besides, those who remain after the battle are of little value, for the good have already fallen." End quote.
Wow.
Yeah, so it kind of gives you his mindset a little bit on he wants, and he spoke of it a number of times, but he wants ultimate destruction of everything. If he's going down, he's going to burn as much as he can and destroy as much as he can himself, as opposed to having the Soviet Union or the Allies come in and do it himself. And Albert Speer was trying to save the German industrial complex, or the basically the industry of Germany. Albert Speer was like trying to save it. Like, once this war is over, we're going to need to rebuild. And so they were kind of having that discussion, and that was like Hitler's like main statement. Like, everybody worth any value has already died, and us losing the war, basically he considered losing the war as treason. Everybody who failed and didn't die for their country has committed treason against the country.
Well, we got to keep Volkswagen, so there is that.
Yeah. Yeah, they that's one of the main companies that kind of came out of World War II that was like, they have a pretty checkered past, but
well, yeah. And they continued it. Well, actually, we should do an episode on them, and their shenanigans, but that's a that's a whole other topic, though.
I just read something about their whole diesel engines and stuff recently. That's pretty shocking.
The thing that bothered me the most, actually, I saw a whole documentary on it, was when they were testing the exhaust fumes on like monkeys or something. And yeah. I just like, that's horrible. You don't need to do that. That's awful. Why? It's completely unnecessary. Leave those poor monkeys alone. Put them out in a zoo or in the wild. Let them throw poop, whatever, dude. Just leave them alone. They just put them in a cage. But anyway, let's not get it. It's a whole other thing.
That's a whole other episode.
Yeah. So
Also,
a lot of the Nazis actually fled to Argentina and other parts of the world. So some
mhm.
of them did get away, and that's a big reason why a lot of people, not just back then, but even up to this day, they believe that there's a strong possibility Hitler also fled because so many people did. So many people who should have been tried for war crimes actually got to go and live in peace somewhere else.
Yeah. So at the end, pretty much everybody fled the bunker, and there was two guys left in the bunker. It was the two engineers, one guy named Herschel and one guy named Mish. Um, Everybody had fled. Everybody else had left and tried to get away, and these guys are just kind of, I mean, if you can imagine, they're sitting in the bunker waiting to see, what's happening and who's. They assume that somebody's going to throw in some grenades or flashbangs and pretty much like come in guns blazing, and it doesn't really happen like that. It's kind of funny, but these Soviet Union soldiers show up, but there's a bunch of women that show up first, and they come in and they ask these two remaining guys, where. Nothing about Hitler. They ask him where is Ava Braun's clothes, and they go and like raid her closet and like for a couple of hours until the like main forces of the Soviet Union army show up, and they kind of like skate out of there so they don't get reprimanded for stealing her stuff, but they take a bunch of her dresses and a bunch of things, and so it's this weird like thing. And if you can kind of put yourself in their shoes, they've been through this brutal war, and nobody's got the mindset of trying to preserve anything. They've got the mindset that this hell of a war is over, and let's fucking celebrate, and let's get some revenge on Germany and raid and pillage this land. So there's no real thought of preserving anything, of crime scene, or nobody really cares where Hitler is, or at least the main forces. Like, they're just happy that this war is ending, and they're not asking questions about, where's Hitler. 2 hours later, the rest of the soldiers kind of show up, and there's this weird thing. Like I said, they let Soviet Union come in first and have that honor, and the Allies didn't go into Germany or into Berlin for 2 months after April 30th, 1945. They came in July. So by that point, the Allies are extremely concerned about what happened with Hitler. And the only thing that they've heard so far was a radio message went out and basically said that Hitler died fighting in battle heroically. And so this kind of like this Nazi propaganda that like they're basically just trying to play that like he's a martyr and he died for your country, so you should die for him. And that's all that the Allies really know. They start asking about what happened to Hitler, and there's a guy named Dukov. He's a Soviet Union kind of higher up, and he basically says like, yeah, Hitler's dead. And then Stalin comes out pretty quickly and is like, no, Hitler's not dead. We don't know. We think he escaped. And this is like a super important part where like Dukov, Stalin kind of suspects Dukov of becoming a political rival. And so just to kind of like knock him down a peg, he comes out and is like, Dukov comes out and is like, yeah, we've got the remains of Hitler, blah, blah, blah. And Stalin's like, no, you don't. And just kind of like knocks him down a peg and is like, no, you're wrong. Hitler escaped. And kind of right after that, Dukov falls back in line and says, okay, well, maybe he escaped on a plane to South America or to Spain. And there's a number of reasons why this is beneficial for Stalin. One of them to knock down, a future political rival. But also, if Hitler's dead, there's no reason for the Soviet Union to remain in Berlin and in Germany. If he's possibly still alive or has possibly escaped, that gives Stalin the reason why, to say like, hey, well, he's possibly still here. I'm going to keep my forces here and stay longer than I necessarily would, had it come out that Hitler was dead. So that was like a big thing that like, if he came out and agreed with Dukov looks good and he doesn't get to stay in Germany as long and kind of occupy that side of Germany. And he's kind of trying to justify his vengeance there, like, like prolong this ravaging of Germany and the revenge that he wanted to, show his people that he was getting for them. Basically, what had happened was they waited 2 months before the Allies could come into Berlin and kind of investigate themselves. Stalin, they did find the remains and they just ended up burying it. And like I said, they occupied Eastern Germany for quite a while. They didn't do anything. They didn't really do any investigation of anything. They kind of perpetuated the conspiracy that he possibly escaped. And it wasn't until like a year and a half later that they went back in, dug up the remains, and that's where we get the skull fragments and the jawbone. And they went and buried it somewhere in Eastern Germany. And then they realized when they were giving Eastern Germany back to Germany, they realized that we need to destroy these remains because, and it wasn't just the skull and the jawbone, it was all of the remains. And they decided we need to destroy this stuff because if anybody ever finds out where it's buried, which at that point in time it was buried in Eastern Germany, if anybody finds out, they didn't want it to become like this memorial, like rise of the Fourth Reich kind of like burial site, like, what's the word?
Yeah, sort of like a monument or something.
Yeah, exactly. A monument to Hitler. They didn't want that at all. So they dug up the remains, they cremated them again, and then pretty much just dumped them in a river where they were pretty much never to be seen again, except for a skull fragment and the jawbone. And they took that back to Germany or back to Russia, and then didn't let anybody have any access to it for a long time until about 2009. Let's see, I got his name right here. The Americans finally got access. They sent an expert, Nick Bellantoni, and he analyzed the skull fragments in 2009. He basically concluded that it was not Hitler's, and that it was a skull of a woman, most likely under 40, and that really made the that really made the Russians mad because this is like their trophy of World War II, their victory trophy that they conquered Hitler. And so they weren't going to have, at the very least, they weren't going to let any Americans near any other type of like studying or analyzing of the rest of the remains in the jawbone. And so it wasn't until 2017 that they finally let a French expert, Philippe Charlier, come in and analyze the jawbone. And he really wasn't supposed to do anything with it except for just kind of look at it. And he wasn't allowed to really do much except for look at it, just because of what had happened with the Americans. They were worried, if we have a second expert come out and say that this isn't Hitler's either, we're screwed. But I mean, like, it's gonna look bad for them that they've held up that they've had his remains. After a while, they came out and they said that he was dead and they had the remains, and so that was just gonna look really bad on them. Well, it turns out that Charlier came out and said, this is absolutely the jawbone and the teeth of Hitler. As far as his records go, they had some, it's kind of weird. And again, this whole historic story has like tons of gaps and loose ends all over the place. So it's easy to make it into a conspiracy, and it's understandable why it became one. But basically his dental records were pictures drawn by dentists from memory of Hitler's mouth. But eventually they did produce. Hitler went to prison after something called the beer hall putsch, and it's basically like the beer hall putsch was in 1923. It was where Hitler and the Nazi Party attempted to overthrow the Weimar Republic, and basically kind of like a coup. Hitler got caught. It was unsuccessful, and he got sentenced to 5 years in prison. He ended up only serving 9 months. But at his entry to this prison, this jail sentence, he was x-rayed. And so they got copies of the x-rays and the skull and were able to kind of match the teeth and the dental records with that. Eventually, they did do some DNA testing and definitively proved that this jawbone was Hitler's. He also Charlier came out and said that it's possible that this skull fragment was still Hitler's. It's not a guarantee that it was a woman's skull. Some of the reasons why Bellantoni kind of
yeah, he said it was a woman's skull because it was like thin or something, right?
Right. Yeah. It was thinner than what it should be, and the sutures weren't fully connected or something along those lines. And basically, it's just it's uncommon, but not out of the question for a man that age of 56 to have a thinner skull. It's uncommon, but it's not, impossible. But so after some testing and stuff, they came out in 2018 and with their report and definitively proved that was Hitler's. And since then, there's been a lot more testing on it that's kind of just corroborated it. But yeah, like you were saying, like you have U-boats starting to show up in Argentina and in South America. You have planes making it to Spain and Italy. And one thing that show, Hunting Hitler, does really well is it kind of shows the Nazi infrastructure in South America and in Spain. And one thing I learned from that show, one of the episodes, they talk about how the Red Cross was set up all over Spain and Italy. And a lot of these Nazis were fleeing from Germany and different places where they were stationed and going to Spain and to Italy to the Red Cross. And if you can kind of see it as from the Red Cross's perspective, like we have a bunch of war victims and they have everything has been destroyed in their lives. They've lost their identity, social security cards or birth certificates or, whatever identification they may have is all lost. So the Red Cross is issuing new identities for people. And so all of these Nazis end up going to the Red Cross, getting completely new identities with completely fake names, but it's like paper legal. Like the Red Cross basically says, what's your name? And they tell them a fake name. And then the Red Cross gives them a passport and a birth certificate, and full on identification of a different person. So that's one of the ways where these guys were able to escape so easily, was that in trying to do something good, the Red Cross actually kind of aided their escape, I guess. And like in the FBI, all the FBI papers that came out, let's see, in 2011, I think it was.
Yeah, you'd like to hope that the Red Cross did help some people that genuinely needed help, that it wasn't all a bunch of...
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, hopefully it wasn't all war criminals, right?
Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of people that it did benefit, just as an unlikely or an unfortunate kind of happenstance of that was these Nazis also were able to get away. And
now, going back to Argentina real quick. Now, I read that Hitler or his regime or whatever had paid a guy named Pedro, what was his name? Juan Perón and his wife Evita,
Oh yeah.
the Nazi party had paid them a lot of money, and that's why they were so accommodating when people fled there.
Yeah, Perón. They, and like we kind of mentioned, that's one thing that the Hunting Hitler show really shed a good light on, was that there was really a Nazi infrastructure set up, and Perón was completely accepting. He was a dictator in his own right, and they had a whole setup for anybody basically fleeing, and Germans were completely welcome. After the war, it's really weird because so you have these FBI papers come out where people are saying that they've seen Hitler and different high-ranking Nazis, and so a lot of the paper, I think there was like 700 papers where these people are having sightings. One thing that the show, the History Channel show, kind of leaves out is like there were also sightings in like Japan and America and I think Australia, like all over the world, but they really just focused on the ones in Argentina. And it makes a bit of sense because there was a pretty solid structure set up there for him to escape to. And he may have had that planned at some point, or he may have been to Argentina as some kind of like, end of the war vacation or, like whatever. I don't know what he possibly was planning, but like maybe if he did want to escape, he had it set up to where he could have, but it kind of ended up coming down to, the cards falling a little bit differently. But there were definitely Nazis that did escape. Like we have the Israel found Adolf Eichmann and discovered that he had escaped to Argentina, and they pretty much like kidnapped him in the night and brought him back to Israel to stand for his war crimes, and they were not too kind to him, which is good. I mean,
Israel got real good at catching Nazis at some point, and they did some pretty shady stuff themselves, but you're like, yeah, but they're catching Nazis. So.
Right, yeah. It's kind of like...
They got it coming,
Yeah. That show was weird because you kind of, at least for me, like I started rooting for the fact that like Hitler got away. And I had this weird conflict. Like I was like, why am I rooting for him to have successfully made it to Argentina? And I kind of realized, well, it's like he kind of got away with his own action. He got away with his behavior by committing suicide. So if he escaped, then there's a possibility that we could catch him and he could, we could finally have some justice for all of his bullshit. But it was kind of a conflicting thing that I felt watching that show. At some point I realized, I was just like, man, like, why did I have wanted him to get away? But it's because I wish he would have gotten caught,
Yeah.
Instead of taking the easy way out of like a suicide or something.
Well, I think sometimes when you have somebody like Hitler, especially for us, I mean, we weren't around during World War II. Like I don't know. I don't know if anybody is still around from that time, but we didn't experience that stuff firsthand. So for us, it's just like a story. So you have the heroes and the anti-heroes. And some people root for the anti-heroes. Like we did an episode on DB Cooper. He's sort of like this anti-hero, and like a lot of people root for it. I'm not comparing him to Hitler necessarily.
Right.
I'm talking about the psychology of it. Is there is something appealing about rooting for the villain sometimes, and you've seen that in many movies. So it's a weird psychological thing. I wouldn't worry about it too much,
Yeah.
Don't get me started on the Milgram studies. Let's not talk about that right now.
Yeah, so it was just there was, I think one thing that lends a lot to this is that they did start catching actual high-ranking Nazis. Like you have Mengele, I think the Doctor of Death or whatever his nickname was, like one of the most evil people in that whole regime. And he unfortunately just died of old age fucking surfing, from what I found. Like he just died happy on the beach, whatever. And it's just like, it's very unfair of a world. But So Mengele and Eichmann were two very high-ranking Nazis. There was a conspiracy that Bormann also made it to I think Buenos Aires to Argentina, and had a illegitimate daughter that he raised, and this, that, and the other. But it was proven that he was killed in Germany, or possibly committed suicide in Germany as well, and his remains were uncovered basically in this one area in Germany. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. I don't know if you guys want to talk about some more conspiracies. There's
any
no
number
end.
of reports throughout the years that people would come forward, especially people from the Soviet Union. Like, I was a former soldier in the Soviet Union, and I saw, that this happened and Hitler really got away. Or, even German people, German soldiers or people claiming to be German soldiers came out throughout the years. And by throughout the years, I really mean it. I don't mean just in the 40s. I mean, over time,
Right.
there have been
Right.
an awful lot of reports of people claiming that, oh, I was with him in the bunker and we escorted him out on some tanks, or, he got to some U-boats or whatever. But none of them offer any actual proof that I could find.
Yeah.
They're just people telling a story, and many of them probably seeking some sort of, payment, or maybe they're trying to publish a book or something. But I did find one that I'll say is my favorite, which is, hold on, let me scroll up in my notes a little bit here. So my personal favorite conspiracy was, there was a guy in 1946, a preacher named William Henry Johnson claimed to be Hitler, and that he escaped to Kentucky of all places, which is just ridiculous because, you're going to go to the place that wants to get you the most. I mean, you're not going to go to the United States, and you're not going to go to, Russia. Those two places would be ridiculous. Even if you're German and you're going there, why would you go there? Like, they don't want you, nobody's going to treat you nice there. It's stupid. But I guess you could make an argument that, hiding in plain sight or whatever, something like that. But anyways, the preacher claimed that he was Hitler, and through letters, I guess he wrote letters or whatever and published them. And he said that he was going to conquer not just the world, but the universe using nuclear bombs and invisible spaceships. And somehow he was able to raise $15,000, which would be approximately $150,000 in today's money,
wow.
by, I guess, just putting these stories out there and asking for donations. Now, does that mean that there's a lot of Nazi sympathizers in Kentucky? I don't know. That's a lot of money back then. If
Yeah.
But this guy was eventually arrested and convicted for mail fraud in 1956. But it's just such a wild story. Like, if you read in 1956, who in their right mind is going to read a story, say, oh, this really is Hitler, I'm going to send him some money so he can do his bad stuff,
Yeah.
digging tunnels under, I guess he said there were tunnels going under Washington, D.C. and stuff. And there were, it's a whole thing. Like, you could probably do a whole episode just on this one guy.
This one guy.
It's pretty ridiculous, but that was my personal favorite story. But yeah, there's a lot of stories throughout the years, but one conspiracy that we could look at that I think would probably fit the facts is that a lot of these stories coming out did come from the Soviet Union. And I think there's an argument to be made that the Soviet Union had, they were trying to throw us off the trail. They knew that the CIA was out there looking for stuff, and they were trying to throw false trails out there so that they would go chasing after something that didn't actually exist. And that's one idea as to why they put out these stories. I mean, like, you spoke a little bit earlier about some other reasons, but that's one thing that I thought about when I was looking at the stuff earlier today.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of reasons why it benefits the Soviet Union to kind of disinform the Allies and the United States, just kind of get you looking in one area while we can do something else over here, and you guys are busy over there with this, wild goose chase, if you will. But all the FBI records, they kind of they do their due diligence in a lot of these reports and a lot of these sightings or whatever reporting people are doing. Like, hey, I saw Hitler in Queens, behind a counter of a sandwich factory, and or I saw Hitler on a bus and it must be Hitler. So there's a lot of those types of reports, but then there are some pretty credible ones. There's a couple that are pretty credible coming from South America and different areas. And really one main reason why the FBI is kind of taking this so seriously is because they were worried that whoever's starting these rumors is trying to keep the memory of Hitler going and trying to gain support and start a Fourth Reich. And so it was a big deal of like, we need to make sure that this isn't what's happening. These people aren't saying, this just because, they're delusional, or is it because they're trying to like incite support and also fear, of a Fourth Reich.
Yeah, and that sounds kind of crazy, but if you look back at, like you were saying, how people committed suicide for him,
Mm-hmm.
This guy was not just charismatic. He was something else. He was next level. He really, it's hard to explain, but if you go back and you look at just how people reacted to this guy, it's almost like he had some sort of hypnotism or magic or something. He was able to just get people to do what he wanted. He was unbelievably charismatic. He was like, he's the kind of person I imagine who, you meet and you're like, oh, that was somebody special, and I'm not trying to put him up on a pedestal, but what I'm trying to say is that that's how revered he was, is that just the rumor of him still being around could rally the forces, get people to come out of retirement, so to speak, and say, oh, is he back? Okay, well, we're going to get back into this thing then,
Right.
Even though we got our asses kicked and our country was destroyed and everything's ruined because of him, we like him so much. He's just so influential. And it's funny because if you go look at, like, if you've ever seen one of his old speeches, it's the craziest thing, because you watch a speech, you're like, I don't even know what the fuck he's saying, but I'm on board, It's just, go watch one of his old speeches and you could see he was like this electric personality. And I can understand why he was just so popular and how he was able to do what he did, even though, obviously he was sort of like, Satan on earth or whatever. He was a very bad man. And I'm not trying to glorify him at all.
Right.
What I am trying to do is sort of explain, like, the psychology of it just fascinates me, how he took a whole nation of people and led them off the cliff into insanity. It's just, it's crazy. It's hard to understand, hard to wrap your head around, but
you're exactly right. There was this huge propaganda shift where he was pretty much like controlling everything that the average German or the average citizen was hearing. And he practiced different ways and different speeches and ways to, like, I think I was reading something or watching something earlier today where they were talking about how he would practice, like, he would go in to one of these big speeches that he would do, and he would talk really monotone and really quiet and mumble, and then he would just like slowly build and build and build until all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he would just start shouting, and just like, pretty much like you kind of said, like, you don't even have to know the language and you're on your feet, like, ready to fucking go to war for this guy. And it was all this like psychological game that he was playing with the audience, and he learned how to do that really well. I don't know if you know much about Houdini, but Houdini was kind of like, would build the suspense, and whenever he would do a trick, he would he would get in this tank of water and then shut the curtains and get out, and it would only take him like a few minutes to get out, but 30 seconds to get out and of his, complete his trick, but he would leave the curtains shut for like 3 or 4 or 5 minutes just to keep the audience in suspense. And Hitler would do things like that. Like, he would be late to his own speeches just to like get everybody kind of like not annoyed, but like build the tension. And then he would always enter from different areas, like random areas where you wouldn't think that he would enter. And he would always just walk up and walk straight through the crowd of people from different, points of entry or depending on the locations of the places. He would always walk through the crowds of people after he had made them wait for a while. So there's already like this psychological game that he's playing with people. And I think that's one thing that really kind of helped him. He had a lot of things that kind of fell in place and he got really lucky with of why he rose to power. But that was one thing he really worked at, where you could kind of see it definitely in his speeches. Like you said, like if you just watch a speech without even knowing any kind of German, you can see why he captivated people and why people were, ready to do anything. And yeah, like not like God level and not to glorify him at all, but like he captivated the mind of the average German citizen, I guess is the best way to put it. But yeah.
Well, and maybe that's the best lesson to take away from the whole Nazi, I don't know even what to call it. It was hell on earth for a while there, but maybe one of the most important lessons to take away is just how he manipulated people, and to be aware of that so we can identify it when it's being done to us today, because those same techniques, guess what? They still work and they're still being used today. And I'm sure there are people out there who are aware of these techniques and are still using them, So it's important to, maybe that's a good takeaway. I don't know. But it's scary to think. It's kind of frightening just how easy it is for certain people to convince other people, like just by using, not by using a good argument or by using, like, hey, let's do this because it's a good idea, but, using things that make them charismatic and they can control. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense, but it's a thing. And I think it's, good to be aware of that. Whether or not being aware of it will help when it's actually happening, I don't know.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of analogies to Trump on kind of like his Trump rallies and how he was doing things. And there's a lot of people make a lot of connections with the way Trump got people riled up and the way Hitler kind of did. And they make comments that he was using some of those same, I guess, tactics or psychological plays with his audience. And it's scary. It's exactly right. Like the general audience or general public, like not to say any individual is stupid, but like the general public is sometimes easily manipulated without realizing the propaganda that's being fed to them.
Yeah. And the scariest thing for me is, do I believe what I believe because it's true and it's right? Or do I believe what I believe because I've been manipulated into doing so? And
exactly.
I can't tell, it's the forest versus the tree sort of a thing. It's scary to think about.
Yeah, exactly right. It's exactly, that's the best way to put it. Forest through the trees. Like, how sure are we of what we believe? Is it because we're persuaded or manipulated into this reality and this perception, or is it because this is true or correct or right?
Yeah, it's that's the kind of thing where you start thinking about that, and you're like, man, I feel like I just smoked a joint, but I like your head just starts getting all twisted up and stuff. You're like, what is real? You don't even real, I don't know. That's a whole wormhole that, it's very uncomfortable to think about. It's like, is you got to think about it from different perspectives and think, okay, what does it look like outside of this perspective? And it's almost impossible to do,
Yeah. It's hard to keep an open mind when a lot of times people have their opinions as part of their identities.
Yeah.
And it's hard to kind of separate yourself from, I want to be right so bad.
Well, and I think that's why we don't generally get too political on this show, because we want this to be a show for everybody, but that's why I think that both sides tend to use polemical arguments where like an argument where you're trying to convince somebody like, hey, let me show you my evidence. That's just a normal argument. Like a polemical, unless I'm getting my terminology mixed up here, but I believe like a polemical argument is where instead you're saying something that's basically offensive, like, oh, you believe that? Well, then you're stupid. But both sides in America, both political parties do that. And I think it's for that reason. They're not doing it to argue a point. They're doing it to, to fire up their base, to get people emotionally involved. And like, yeah, that's right. That guy is stupid, like, because they don't want people to think about the issues. They want people to just react. It's a manipulation, and
it's very team minded. Like my team is the right team or the better team. So whatever they say, I support, and your team is wrong, whatever your team says, because we're on opposite, teams and stuff. And it's a weird dynamic right now.
Yeah. And it's like, if you look at like the government, like they'll, in the Senate or whatever, they're like, okay, we're going to oppose this, whether or not it's a good idea, just because the other guys want it. You're like, well, wait a minute.
What's the point? Yeah.
Whatever happened to like bipartisan like negotiation and compromises and stuff? Yeah. Cause we have a very unique, well, I don't know if it's unique, but we got 50 states that could be individual nations, each individual one. So you have to somehow compromise between all these different states. And even some of the states, like I live in California, and California itself could be a bunch of different areas. Like it's not homogenous at all. It's a really big area with different populations. And it's like that all over the country. And it's like, we got to compromise here at some point. It's like, there's not one size fits all, but that's what they try selling you in these political arguments. Like, okay, this is right, this is wrong. And it's like, well, what about there being some sort of conversation about all that stuff? And it's just kind of scary because it's sort of, it reminds me of certain things like what this episode's about,
Yeah.
Although knock on wood, hopefully that, we don't end up in a situation. I think the difference is with Nazi Germany is that the government was basically taken over by one party. So when you have two parties fighting each other, that prevents that sort of situation. But if one party were ever to take total power, God help us all. And I'm not even a religious man, but that's what I would say,
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened. Kind of, like I kind of mentioned, but like Hitler had a lot of things that kind of fell into place, and luckily, worked out for him. When he was coming into power, I think he won the election to become the next chancellor, and at that point in time, they also had a president who kind of ran the country. And at the time where he became the chancellor, the president at that time was old and frail and pretty much on his deathbed. And when he ended up dying a couple years into Hitler's chancellery, the president ends up dying, and Hitler does this weird, smart thing where he basically dissolves the presidency. And he's like, and this guy was kind of like his rival or his enemy, but he ended up, having such poor health that it didn't really matter, and he wasn't running anything. But Hitler basically says, as this propaganda ploy, like, our president was such a great man that nobody else can be up to his level. So we're going to dissolve the presidency in his honor, and there will never be another president because nobody can stand up to him and be as great as he was.
Wow, that's brilliant.
Yeah, and so he dissolved it, and basically all the power now goes to the chancellor, and that was him. And so it was this weird thing, and it was this very smart move that he kind of, and like I said, it worked out for him because at the time the president was so old and was falling into poor health, and so it was just this lucky thing that like he kind of jumped on and made it work for him and took complete power.
Wow, that's a very intelligent maneuvering there. And it's sort of, so you're propping up your opponent for your own benefit. And I think most people wouldn't be capable of that because, if you got somebody who's your opponent, you're not going to ever prop them up. You're only going to try to knock them down. That's so, yeah, man, that's.
Yeah. And around that time was when he basically told the whole nation that he was no longer the chancellor, he was the Führer, which basically means the leader or the guide. And that became his title. Even though he was a chancellor, he stopped going by, the chancellor or whatever. But he started being referred to as the Führer.
Yeah, and to put it in perspective, if people who are not aware of the history of the time, I think a big part of the reason why he was able to take power is because after World War I, Germany was pretty much, they were on their knees. Like economically, they were in a depression. Like people were super desperate. Like it was a really, really rough time in Germany. So when you have this person coming along and saying, hey, we're going to make things better, basically, and his message, like, it's weird because his message at first, I'm not a historian, but this is how I understand it. He didn't get to power by saying, hey, we're going to kill all of these people. He might have said, hey, these people are bad, and they're like, he targeted the Jews, for example, saying, hey, they're evil and everything, but he didn't necessarily come out and say, we're going to kill them all. He sort of slid into that over time, from what I understand. So you have these people who are really desperate, and they're like, yeah, this minority population that we don't like, sure, we don't like them, let's go ahead and hate on those people. And then, when he got into power and he sort of continued that theme and said, okay, well, anybody who's not with us is against us, and we're going to basically kill them. And that ended up being, a whole lot of people, unfortunately. But it's just a really scary thing. And I think a big part of the reason he was able to accomplish what he did was because of just how desperate the nation was after, the World War I reparations, and just how bad things were in Germany at the time.
Well, yeah, you're right on. Like you said, the end of World War I really left Germany in shambles, and a lot of it came from, a lot of his support came from the fact that the German people were looking for somebody to blame for all of this, and they really got behind this idea of like being a nationalist. And I think they basically, at some point, they made it illegal for Jews to be a citizen or something along those lines. And so it was like, you're not a nationalist, you're not from our nation, and we are all about, the German people and the perfect race, and so they really pitted the society against these people or the Jewish population there. And he came out and was in one of his like party, his National Socialist Party like guidelines and like memos basically to the public of what his party was behind and what they stood for. And he basically said that like, if you're Jewish, it's not a race, it's a religion. Or it's not a religion, it's a race. And basically their God, he kind of like, this is part of his propaganda, but he basically said that they worship money and wealth and themselves and power. And so he kind of just like put this out to all these people and it allowed the society to kind of have somebody to blame for the fact that like these Jewish people are still wealthy, quote unquote wealthy, even after the war, when everybody else, the general German population is suffering and is, after World War I, is in shambles. And he really pitted the quote nationalists, the people he told, you're a nationalist because you're from Germany, you're a German citizen, and you're of German heritage. These people are not like you, and they're the ones we can blame. And so it was really this manipulation of the public.
Yeah, it's really frightening. And like I said, I believe it's the Milgram studies. They tested this, and I'm laughing because it's terrifying. What they did was they put people in a situation where they basically use an authority figure to tell them to do bad stuff to other people, and they did. This was an experiment, and they found that they were able to take normal people.
Yeah.
And the thing that's so frightening about this is that, we all think, we're better than the Germans at that time. We would never do that kind of stuff. But I mean, the study suggests that a lot of people would actually fall in line if you were not, one of these minority populations. And it's just absolutely terrifying to think, the end, the punchline here is that this could all happen again. That's where I'm going with this, is that our modern society, like, we have not evolved at all past where the Germans were at, and it's possible to get there again. And it's just absolutely terrifying.
Yeah. I think one of the a big problem is like the structure of our society relies on trusting our government and relies on trusting, like, we as a society, we're more successful when we can trust our government. And so we have to rely on the fact that we don't have much, many other choices as to, like, sure, a lot of us can kind of realize that it's all bullshit anyways, but for society to function in a certain way, we have to accept that, the police are there to protect us and the politicians are there to do our bidding as citizens. And even though I think there's a big population that doesn't believe that and doesn't, think that that's happening necessarily right now, which I kind of see, both sides, but yeah, it's easy. And it, like you said, it can happen again. And that's one thing that's really scary. There's a lot of reasons why that we shouldn't trust our government. I mean, they've proven it themselves. They've lied to us and done different things where, like Iran-Contra or Watergate. And
what about Operation Paperclip, where
exactly,
where our government is like, okay, Nazis are bad, but if they have some knowledge we can use, then they get off scot-free.
What lesson does that teach you?
How can you trust a government that's willing to hire Nazis? It's crazy.
You can get away with anything as long as you're smart enough.
Yeah. Well, it's like, to use an example that's not quite as extreme as Nazis, is that, I don't know if you've seen that movie Catch Me If You Can, about what's that guy's, I forget the guy's name, but that's based on a real story.
DiCaprio.
Yeah, he played him in the movie. And what's that? It's on the tip of my tongue. Anyways,
they show him at the end.
Yeah,
I think I
could Google it. But the thing that really chaps my hide, to coin a phrase, about that movie,
does it really grind your gears?
Yeah, it does grind my gears.
Really boils your water.
Is that this guy committed many crimes over many years, and at the end of it, he gets caught. But instead of putting him in jail because he has a skill to offer, instead they hire him and pay him a bunch of money, and they give him an awesome job. And it's like, I can see the perspective of the government where, okay, we need help catching these people, I guess. But on the other hand, it's like, well, if I get really good at crime, I can just do crime. And then if I get caught, if I'm good enough, the government will just hire me.
I can just help the government stop other people.
So I mean, but if you're not born with the correct talents and you're just a criminal and you break the rules, then you just go to jail for the rest of your life. It's a very unfair system where sometimes people get penalties and sometimes people don't. And it doesn't make any sense to me at all. If you commit the crime, you should go to jail. And if you don't go to jail, why should other people go to jail? Because let's face it, some people are more talented than others. Not all of us are blessed with these extreme talents that the government wants and that will get us off of crimes. Most of us are just average. And if we committed a crime, we would just end up in jail,
Right.
It doesn't make any sense.
Like, the government doesn't care how well I can roll a blunt, but they care how well somebody
but that's an art form.
Yeah, I agree. But they care how well somebody can counterfeit money and checks and stuff. And it's a fucked system. Yeah. But it's a shame.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, on that uplifting note, I mean, that's pretty much all I had. I mean, we covered all the major points, I think, on the death of Hitler. Did you have anything else you wanted to cover?
No, I think that was it. I was going into it, kind of blind when I started the research. I really wasn't sure. Like I said, all I had seen really was that Hunting Hitler show a couple of years ago. And wasn't really aware of what the eventual science that came out was about it. And it's not like they did a show, analyzing Hitler's jaw. They never did that History Channel show. So I wasn't exposed to, the analysis of what it was. And so when I started figuring it out and researching, it was just kind of mind blowing. I wasn't sure if it was even going to be an episode because, at least in the scientific community, it's pretty well understood that he was definitively proven to be to have committed suicide. So I wasn't sure if it would even be worth an episode. But then I realized, I had no clue. So I'm sure there's a lot of people that aren't aware of the science that had come out about it.
Yeah, and just to give the audience an idea of the timeline here, the most recent academic paper I saw was from 2018. So this has been going on for a very long time, right?
Yeah.
It's been ongoing to get like some sort of scientific consensus, and I could see the arguments both ways. Like if you look at a certain part of the arguments, it's real easy to make an argument that he escaped. I mean, you could say that, he did all this stuff saying that, we want this funeral and stuff and talking about suicide just as sort of like a blind or to cover his exit. And he was a very, very clever dude. So you could make the argument that he'd be clever enough to escape Germany and go to Argentina or wherever, and it's not that hard to make that sort of an argument. But if you look at like the X-rays, which, I didn't know about until you told me about them, a few days ago. The last I heard, so I had never looked into this in detail. The last I heard, like they had the dental records, which were basically, like you said, the dentist like hand drew some stuff, but I mean, that may or may not be that accurate.
Right.
So as far I was
from memory.
Yeah, I was not aware of like the recent developments that we pretty much have proof that he did die in the bunker, or but it's kind of makes it an interesting conspiracy that if you take the certain pieces of data, sort of like the moon landing, you could definitely frame it to where it happened or it didn't happen depending on what argument you wanted to make. But when you look at the totality, it seems to me that he really did die in the bunker. I mean, it is definitely more evidence pointing towards that than against.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that's so big about this is that it was totally possible. If he wanted to, he probably definitely could have escaped and gotten away with, at least gotten to Argentina or wherever he wanted. Probably he had the funds and support.
Hitched a ride on a submarine.
He had the means to be successful in escaping, and that's one thing that's like such a big part of the conspiracy is that it was possible, and it's pretty clear that it was feasible for him to get away. But yeah, I would probably last thing I would just want to say, if anybody's interested, my main sources of kind of research and all this, I would recommend, if you're interested, there's a book called The Last Days of Hitler, the 7th edition, and that's by a guy named Hugh Trevor Roper. He was an MI5, basically an intelligence officer for the British Army, and he wrote this book. He was the main guy doing the investigating for the United States. They hired him to do the investigation, and he wrote this really good book. I would definitely recommend that. And then there's a book called What Really Happened: The Death of Hitler by Robert J. Hutchinson. That one talks about kind of the science and stuff afterwards, and what all happens with Russia and Stalin, and basically the science of the jawbone and the analysis and the teeth and the skull fragments and stuff. So if anybody's interested, I would definitely recommend those two books.
All right, yeah, I'll link those in the description so people can find them easily.
Perfect.
And so do you have any final thoughts on this, ETA?
I guess as far as like what my opinion of what really happened is, like, I think that I'm in agreement with like the main like general story that he died right there at that bunker, and it was just the confusion within the story. Basically, it's just how that information was handled, like between like the Soviets and and everybody else. You know what I mean? So there are so many different stories that came out, so many different things that people said had happened. You know, whether he took poison or he shot himself in the head, or whether he had switched with a body double and then made his way on a submarine down to Argentina. I don't think that's likely, to be honest. I think that he probably died there in Germany, at the bunker.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my opinion, to be honest. That's probably most likely what happened, I think.
Yeah, this seems to be that in this case, which is pretty rare for our show, seems to be that the prevailing opinion seems to be the most likely one, which doesn't happen that often in stuff that we cover, actually, believe it or not. But all right, so before we finish up here, do you want to plug any socials or anything else like that?
Yeah, no, I really don't do social media. I know that's kind of uncommon, but yeah, here in a couple weeks, I'll let you guys know if you want to tell your audience. But my podcast will be coming out with our first episode on the Fermi paradox. And again, our podcast is called Aliens After Dark, so definitely check it out.
All right, and you also did an episode on this topic that you haven't released yet. Is that correct?
Yes, I haven't released any episodes yet. I've kind of just been trying to get some recorded. I've done Fermi Paradox. Let's see, I did DB Cooper, which was really fun. I did Betty and Barney Hill, and yeah, my most recent one was Hitler, and that one that one will be my last one so far that I've done and will release. So
all
definitely
good
check that
topics.
one out, because it was a lot of research went into that, and it was really interesting. So
yeah, that's the fun thing about these topics, is that quite often I'll have a topic, okay, let's do this. I think, there's probably not going to be that much to it. And then you end up going down the rabbit hole and you find, oh, there's way more than I thought,
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, usually I try to take about a week to 2 weeks to really dive in, and the more I got into this, it took me like a month to kind of get through everything and really dig up everything that I could. Which after a certain point, it gets pretty repetitive. You're kind of finding the same conspiracies and the same, story. But I wanted to get really as much of an understanding of like his early life, his rise to power, and why he would have killed himself. What his mindset was.
Yeah.
Towards the end of his life.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I guess that's about all we have for this week. So thanks for listening. And normally Ether would say, keep it strange, but she's not here. So I'm going to go ahead and say, or unless somebody else wants to say, anybody else want to close us off here? Perhaps Agent ETA?
Keep it strange, you fucks.
All right. There we go. All right. I'm going to hit stop record here.